Now, this is interesting. 54 African nations are calling on the United Nations to urgently debate racism and police brutality amidst the unrest in the United States. Burkina Faso's ambassador to the UN is asking the UN Human Rights Council to look into human rights violations worldwide against people of African descent. We actually have South African author Benjamin Pogrund joining us. So, Africa is obviously a huge continent with lots of countries, but talk to us about what Africans across the region have to say about the anti-racism protests that we're seeing worldwide. Are there different responses based on country?
Well, there's basically a general African response which Burkina Faso has articulated, and you'll find that throughout most of Africa, because what's been happening in America has been an offense to any black person.
Right.
And as we know, this burst of anger and rage in America is the result of pent-up anger from many years, and is quite justified. And what is interesting to see is whether this is going to peter out, or as it's sweeping through the world now, whether in fact it's going to transform racism in the world. And that's not just America, but it's Britain, it's Israel, it's Russia, it's China, it's worldwide. And it's time that the world confronted it and dealt with it. In regard to Africa, though...
Yeah.
Sorry, yes?
No, go ahead. I'd like to hear actually what you're going to say.
No, in regard to Africa, the message is important and accurate in calling on America to come up to do something about this. The problem is the messengers are not the greatest. They're not kosher. First of all, the UN Human Rights Council has got a dreadful record. It's singled out Israel. It's been biased towards Israel for many years. America has been in and out of the council. It left it 2 years ago and said it was hypocritical and self-serving. And its membership is ridiculous. You've got people like Libya, Pakistan, Qatar, who've been members or are members, and they can certainly, it's offensive to have them talk to anyone else about human rights. And then in regard to Africa itself, Burkina Faso, if you just look at it, this wretched country, 20 million people, it's got terrible problems. It's got an Islamicist army attacking it, but its own domestic record for the ambassador of Burkina Faso to point the finger at anyone else is an absurdity. And that's the trouble, because the message is valid, but the messengers are not so good.
It's interesting that you say that. Now, you were a very close friend of Nelson Mandela. You wrote a book about him, and much of your work has really been focused on exposing the voices of ordinary black people who have been systematically silenced by apartheid and racism. Do you see these protests as a watershed moment of sorts? What do you think Mandela would say about what's happening right now?
No, well, obviously, he'd be against it. I still remember vividly, before he became president, his first visit to Africa, he went to Ghana, to that notorious place on the west coast where slaves were shipped. See, the other point to remember, America is rightly being condemned for the racism. But one's also got to remember America is not the biggest culprit. In the slave trade that went on for 300-400 years, firstly, African chiefs connived in it. They sold to the European traders who came to them. They sold the people they had captured in battle, or sold their own people. On the east coast of Africa, Arab traders were active there for years, taking people into slavery. And in any event, in terms of the number of slaves, the figure for the United States is about, it ranges from 4 to 10% of the total number. Most people went to Brazil. Where America's offense is that it has allowed the racism to continue. It has perpetuated it. It has allowed inequalities to grow. And the Europeans have been the chief racists against black people.
Now, how do you think that Africa has suffered? You mentioned that, there were African chiefs who also conspired with these European colonialists. How has Africa suffered as a result of the slave trade? I mean, millions of natives were stolen away. They were pushed away. It must have impacted the continent as a whole and the economy majorly.
It decimated countries of West Africa. No question. Numbers were reduced. People were just full of fear. Whenever a ship was seen on the horizon, people were terrified. And the crossing to the Americas, in particular, to the Caribbean, to South America and North America, was dreadful. And later on in the 19th century, when Britain started stamping down on the slave trade, and if a British warship saw a slaver and started sailing towards it, they would get rid of the slaves. They were shackled, and they simply be thrown overboard in order to hide the evidence. But their living conditions, millions died in that passage across the Atlantic. The suffering was just beyond description.
Well, listen, I mean, obviously the work that you have done has been so important in exposing what took place so many years ago, and it's going to be very interesting to see how these protests play out. Thank you for giving us some insight into, the African mindset surrounding these protests, Benjamin Pogrund.
Thank you.